the spring of 1991, a man named Gerald Voss walked out of a courthouse in Albany, New York, during a 15-minute recess, and was never seen again. He was on trial for the murder of his business partner. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The verdict, everyone assumed, was a formality. Gerald Voss never waited to hear it. He left his briefcase on the defense table. He left his coat on the back of his chair. He walked out a side door that was supposed to be locked. For 31 years, nobody knew where he went. Then in 2022, a retired detective looking through old case files for an unrelated matter noticed something in a community newsletter from a small town in Oregon. A photograph of a 78-year-old man being honored for 50 years of volunteer service. The face was older, heavier, different in every way that 30 years should change a face. But the eyes were exactly the same. Gerald Voss had been, by every account, an unremarkable man before 1991. He ran a small accounting firm in Albany with his business partner, Daniel Pruitt. The two had known each other since college. Their wives were friends. Their children played together. Eileen Voss, Gerald's wife at the time, described their marriage as ordinary, stable, quiet. The kind of life nobody writes stories about. Until the morning Daniel Pruitt was found dead in the firm's office, a single gunshot wound, and $300,000 missing from a client trust account that only 2 people had access to. Gerald Voss was arrested within a week. He maintained his innocence completely. He told police, and later his lawyer, that Daniel had discovered something he wasn't supposed to find. Something involving people far more dangerous than either of them. Nobody believed him. The trial began in March 1991. By April, it was clear which way the jury was leaning. Gerald Voss understood the math. And on April 23, 1991, he made a decision that would define the next 31 years of his life. He disappeared. Detective Lena Marsh was 45 years old when the Voss case landed on her desk in 2022, though it had nothing to do with Gerald Voss directly. She had been reviewing cold cases as part of a department-wide audit. Old files that had never been formally closed. The Voss file had sat untouched for over a decade. What caught her attention wasn't the murder. It was the disappearance itself. In 31 years, Gerald Voss had never resurfaced. No bank accounts, no property, no social security activity under his name, no driver's license renewal, nothing. People who disappear usually make mistakes eventually. A phone call to a relative, a credit card used at the wrong moment. A photograph posted online by someone who didn't know better. Gerald Voss had made none of these mistakes for 3 decades. Marsh found that more disturbing than almost anything else in the file, because it meant one of 2 things. Either Gerald Voss was dead, or Gerald Voss had become someone else entirely. So completely that even he had stopped thinking of himself as Gerald Voss. Marsh requested the original case photographs. She wanted to see his face again. She had a feeling she would need to recognize it. The community newsletter that changed everything came from a small town called Millbrook, Oregon, population just under 2,000 people. It featured a man named Richard Cole, 78 years old, being recognized for 50 years of volunteer work with the local fire department. Richard Cole had lived in Millbrook since 1992, according to town records. He had arrived with no family, working first as a bookkeeper for a local lumber mill before eventually starting his own small accounting practice. He had never married. He had no children. He attended the Methodist church every Sunday and was, by every account from every resident interviewed, one of the kindest men anyone in Millbrook had ever known. He had helped elderly residents with their taxes for free for over 40 years. Marsh stared at the newsletter photograph for a long time. The bone structure matched. The set of the eyes matched exactly. She pulled Richard Cole's Social Security records. The number had been issued in 1991 to a man who, according to every official record, had been born in 1944 in a small town in Kansas that, according to county archives, had no birth certificate on file for anyone with that name in that year. Richard Cole did not exist before 1991. Gerald Voss had stopped existing at exactly the same time. Marsh drove to Millbrook herself in October 2022. She didn't call ahead. She didn't request local police assistance. She wanted to see his face before he had any chance to prepare for it. She found him at the fire department's annual dinner, sitting at a table near the back, laughing quietly at something a young firefighter had said. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 50 years being decent to people. Marsh sat down across from him. She said only one sentence. "Hello, Gerald." The man who called himself Richard Cole went completely still. For nearly 30 seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way a person sets something down when their hands have started to shake and they don't want anyone to notice. He looked at Marsh for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I've been waiting 31 years for someone to finally ask the right question." Marsh leaned forward. "What's the right question?" she asked. Gerald Voss smiled, for the first time in the entire conversation, and it was not a smile of relief. It was a smile of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and was finally about to put it down. "Ask me who really killed Daniel Pruitt," he said, "because it wasn't me, and I can finally prove it." What Gerald Voss told Detective Marsh that night took 4 hours to fully explain. Daniel Pruitt, his former business partner, had discovered 6 months before his death that their accounting firm was being used to launder money for a network connected to a state senator's re-election campaign. Pruitt had photographs, documents, bank records. He had told Gerald everything exactly 9 days before he was murdered. Gerald said he had begged Daniel to go to the FBI. Daniel said he wanted 1 more week to gather absolute proof. He never got that week. When Daniel was found dead, the same people Gerald believed were responsible had already planted evidence pointing directly at him. The missing trust account funds. The gun registered in his name that he had never purchased. Witnesses who claimed to have seen an argument that Gerald insisted never happened. He said he ran not because he was guilty, but because he understood, sitting in that courtroom, that the people who killed Daniel Pruitt had enough power to make sure he was convicted for it. He had nothing to fight back with, no proof, no witnesses, no allies. So he became someone else because it was the only option that didn't end with him dead in a cell within his first year of incarceration. Marsh sat across from him in stunned silence. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Gerald, do you still have any of that proof?" Gerald Voss reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small, weathered key. "It's been in a safety deposit box in Bend, Oregon since 1994, he said. "I've been paying the rental fee in cash every single year for 28 years. I always knew this day might come. I just didn't know if I'd still be alive to see it." The safety deposit box, when opened under warrant 3 days later, contained exactly what Gerald said it would. Photographs, financial records, a handwritten letter from Daniel Pruitt himself, dated 1 week before his death, detailing everything he had discovered and naming the people involved. The state senator named in the documents had died in 2009, but 2 of his former campaign associates named in Pruitt's letter were still alive, one of them now a sitting federal judge. The case reopened formally in November 2022. Forensic experts re-examined the original 1991 evidence using technology that didn't exist at the time of the murder. The gun registered to Gerald Voss was found to have ballistics inconsistencies that had never been properly investigated in the original trial. A witness who had testified against Gerald in 1991 came forward in 2023, now in his 70s and dying of cancer, and admitted under oath that he had been paid to lie about the argument he claimed to have witnessed. He said the men who paid him had told him Gerald Voss would never be found to contradict the story. They had been wrong for 31 years. They were wrong now. Eileen Voss, Gerald's former wife, was 74 years old when she received the phone call informing her that her husband had been found alive in Oregon. She had remarried in 1997, believing for over 2 decades that Gerald had either died somewhere unknown or had simply abandoned her and their 2 children without a single word of explanation. Their children, now in their 50s, had grown up believing their father was either a murderer who fled justice or a coward who couldn't face the consequences of his actions. Both of these beliefs had shaped nearly every major decision in their adult lives. When Eileen finally spoke to Gerald again, 31 years after he disappeared from that courthouse hallway, the conversation lasted 6 hours. She later told a reporter that the hardest part wasn't anger. It was grief for the version of their life that should have existed. The one where Gerald came home that night in 1991, and they figured out the truth together. The one where their children grew up with a father instead of a question mark. Gerald Voss formally cleared his name in an Albany courtroom in June 2023, 32 years after he had walked out of that same building believing it was the only way to survive. The judge who vacated his conviction noted for the record that this was, to her knowledge, the longest gap in state history between a wrongful conviction and its formal correction. Gerald Voss did not return to using his real name full-time after the case concluded. He told Detective Marsh, in their final recorded conversation, that Richard Cole had become more real to him than Gerald Voss ever was. Richard Cole had built something. 50 years of small kindnesses. A community that trusted him completely. A life built entirely on decency, ironically constructed to hide from the consequences of a decency that had gotten his best friend killed. He said he would split his time between Millbrook and Albany for the rest of his life, honoring both names, both versions of a man who had spent 3 decades being punished for a crime he never committed. The 2 surviving men named in Daniel Pruitt's letter were indicted in early 2024. Their trial is still ongoing. Eileen Voss attends every hearing. She told reporters she isn't there for revenge. She says she's there because somebody needs to remember Daniel Pruitt, the man whose only mistake was telling his best friend the truth 9 days before it got him killed. Gerald Voss, now 79 years old, attends every hearing too. He sits in the back. He says very little, but every time the judge calls a recess, he stays exactly where he is. Detective Lena Marsh closed the Voss file in March 2024, 33 years after Gerald Voss walked through a side door that was supposed to be locked. She later said it was the only case in her career where finding the truth didn't feel like winning. It felt like watching someone finally put down something they had been carrying for so long that the weight had become indistinguishable from who they were. Richard Cole still volunteers with the Millbrook Fire Department. The town held a small ceremony when the truth became public, and not a single resident asked him to leave or looked at him differently. One neighbor told a local reporter that finding out Richard Cole was actually an innocent man named Gerald Voss didn't change anything about who he was. It just explained why he had always seemed like someone who understood, better than anyone else in town, exactly how much an ordinary life was worth protecting. Gerald Voss kept both names engraved on his mailbox when he finally returned home to Millbrook. Richard Cole, Gerald Voss. He said both men deserved to be remembered, because both of them, in their own way, had survived something that should have destroyed them completely.